Midsummer 906. Osrith returned home. Dunnottar, with Edra in hand and Sainid beside her, was home, she realized, throughout her whole being. It didn't matter all that had happened here, in Domhnall's, now Constantine's, kingdom, nor in Wessex. She was a Bernician noble in the employ of the king of Alba. Thygalesk. The journey back had been difficult. Storms had kept Gert's fishing boat at Hampton, so, the day after their night at the palace, they had waited at the port. Osrith had paid the fisherman well in silver, and he had taken her hand and he promised to find her as soon as he could sail. As it was, they had only spent 2 nights at the muddy, shack-lined quay, where they had fed and coddled Edru, and when the child had slept, Sainid had held her shoulders while she thought of the man who had guided her amongst all things as a child at Bibbenberg, and told Sainid all she could of this man, a priest, a father, a godly man. Alf, Gert's older brother, had found her on the 3rd morning, and they had sailed on a dull, grey morning, tacking east through mist and fog which barely lifted for the majority of the journey back to Alba. While they waited, in the only lodging they could obtain, Sainid had said little, but in that, he sat quietly as Osrith spoke her scant words, scratching a grid on the floor when she'd fallen silent, and handed her some pebbles, and they had played stones in the poor, leaky shelter with one bed and little comfort. Further storms had caused Gert to land at Dunwich and again at Jerome, and had finally spied the twin castles of Culde's monastery on the left and Dunnottar on the right part way through December. Their return was not heralded in the way their departure had. Even Constantine, who had seen them leave, had been without the castle speaking to the current abbot of the monastery about his church reforms. They had waited in the throne room until the king returned, and there was nothing stopping Edra from launching herself at the man she called at her. Constantine confirmed with Sainid that they had met their objective, acknowledging he had kept his word, but said nothing to Osrith before dismissing them. Yet, he called back Osrith. Mary was lost, to a fever, he told her. Osrith was unhappy to hear that. She had liked Mary, the clever, trustworthy, reliable girl she had once taught at the monastery in Doia. Capable, resourceful, happy to be the mother of Constantine's dynasty, mother to Seluk and Ildub, 2 heirs, mother to Malcolm, Era and Domhnall's son, nearly now a man. King Edward sends his regards and thanks you for the Bible, Osrith said, handing over a letter to Constantine, on vellum. Constantine read over it, in the torchlight, then looked back to Osrith. He is building a nation, as am I. Osrith handed him silver for Edra. You found this in Wessex? I earned it in Wessex. I once hid it, and now it is to keep Edra. This was true. Before they had left Winchester, Osrith had taken a detour to Cheapside, her old rented rooms not far from the river. The leather bag containing hacksilver had been there, still, behind the bricks at the back of the chimney. Exactly where she had left it. Constantine had said nothing as Osrith left it beside him. He had taken the silver. That was important. It represented the agreement between them, and his reforms surely must have been costing him. He was rearranging Pitland to be like Dull Rioter, reforming the church, and appointing Mormers, regional lords, to defend different parts of Alba from the Norse and, more importantly, to prevent civil war. And then Constantine had Osrith dine with him, in his quarters, just the 2 of them, remembered Mary, and Becca. Then, he voiced the next part of his role for her, to travel as soon as the weather was hospitable. You must go alone, Constantine said. I know how you must feel about returning to Caligwilid, but you must go. He is your husband, by the law of the church. Constantine fingered a letter which he handed to Osrith. Domhnall knew me to be Edra, and as such I did not wed Guthard of Cumbraland. It was the first time she had proposed that Domhnall knew her identity, the first time she had suggested the king, the former king, had betrayed her. Constantine stared at Osrith, he too saying nothing. A warrior is loyal to his master, Constantine chided, as old Elasade cleared away the dishes. Osrith knew this to be true, but was shocked he had said it. Am I Osrith or Edra? She asked. I need to know if you expect me to hump him. Osrith, Constantine whined, plaintively, "There is only you that can do this for me." He got to his feet, and walked towards the open door, pushing against it. "Do not hump the king of Cumbraland, unless you wish to." There. There it was. The accusation, which was not untrue, that she had wanted to hump the King of Wessex. But in that, it was always like a dream, a spell. So much for her being the witch. Edward, once Atheling, could weave a spell over her that she could not defy. She closed her eyes for a moment as she remembered his soft hands on her body again, and had it not been for Edra, Osric might have stayed with the King of Wessex. Especially if she knew it irked his sister. "I will see if the mood takes me," Osric jibed, leaving a hurt look to pass over his face. "You should be glad that I will undertake this in the winter," she thought, and knew her journey would take her the same route, in reverse, that she and Derek Thurgelson has taken. She missed those days, sometimes, when she was full of hope, and loyalty to Domhnall was everything. There was a thaw, which meant damp ground. But the horse she had taken was every bit as good as she remembered Slipner to be. Not in looks, for she was a piebald, black and white with stiddy legs and wide hooves. Yet, every bit as sure-footed as the black mare who had carried them. That night, after a perfunctory, but not disappointing, expulsion from Constantine's balls, she detailed everything that had happened at Wessex. Osric left out nothing, not even her time spent in the bed of the King of Wessex, though she refused to divulge details. Constantine had received each piece of news matter-of-factly, as if weighing it up and incorporating it immediately into his plan for Alba. Because he, like Alfred, had a plan, and her role, as a person with a stake in both Cumbraland and Bebbanburg, was one this expansionist king would not ignore. As well as exquisite sex with Edward, the King of Wessex had also asked her to spy, in a roundabout way, to get her out of accusation of witchcraft. This, she did not tell Constantine. But what could he do, in any case? The rumor must have come from Dunnottar originally, for only Constantine had been there when she had been attacked by Nine Fingers. And Domhnall, of course. He would have told Domhnall, Malmuir's court would have known what she'd claimed to have done, and so somehow it had passed to the Norse, until it had got to Wessex. Only in that kingdom had it ever given her trouble. It had come from her own mouth, thought of those princes, Nine Fingers and his brother, dead now, she supposed. The Norse had been expelled, Flansinna was eminently successful. Yet Domhnall was not prospering. He and little Neil Glundube, a grown man by now, though Osric ever thought of him as a 3-year-old interested in nature and getting muddy, were both in exile and often in alliance with Doncharda, who hated his father and wished to overthrow Flan. Domhnall had gone back to be king of Ailch, he and Neil had prepared to fight but had decided to share, like Greogair and Diochade. Would she ever see them again? Would she ever travel back to Arion? Before she had left for Caerligwylid, news had come from the Ui Neil that Muir had died, and that Flansinna had secured victory at the Battle of Ballagmoon. He had spent the year erecting monuments in his own honour, as well as pursuing zero tolerance to the Norse, who were still flooding England. And at Candlemas, 2 months after returning to Constantine, and 4 months ago, she stood toe-to-toe facing King Guthred. It had been the first time she had seen him since she was 15, and sitting in the monastery's high tower. Technically, in the eyes of the church that is, they were wed, and that was what mattered, they were married. "Is my sister happy, I wonder?" Guthred had asked her, taking Constantine's letter from her and walking within the city's ground. Frost had decorated the cobbles, and the mud was frozen. Osric remembered the day when Gisela had given her life for hers and Eutad's second son. It had been she who had been the one to give her sister-in-law Ulla's medicine, which the heathen Briton would not administer. Nor, either, would Hild, and it had taken Osric to coax the broth of bishopsweed down the poor woman's throat, to widen the passage, and get the breech baby out. "They have 3 healthy children," Osric told Guthred. "A girl and a boy, and another boy too. Their children live," Guthred summarized, as a bright winter sun irradiated onto their faces. Osric had paused. No one had thought to tell Gisela's brother? She did not survive the birth of her second son, Osrith had told him, quietly. And does he favor his mother or his father? Guthred had asked. And Osrith had looked at his face, honest, decent, thrust into slavery then immediately into kingship. But she knew, for she had seen young Uhtred, the only son his father would acknowledge. He has your face, Osrith told him. Then, that of my mother, Guthred had told her, before turning to Constantine's letter. And, when he had asked his next question, Osrith was sure that the rumors about the king's sanity were true. I can speak for the king in this matter, Osrith had furthered. Guthred had stopped by the drawbridge of the city walls through which he had stormed and had brought Eric Thurgilson to his knees. King Eochaid? No, he is long dead. Dyfnwil? Osrith had shaken her head. Owain? But, at the time Osrith excused his forgetfulness by remembering that Guthred lived in Eoferwick for most of the time, and it was widely known that Akin of Ivar, being run close in Ireland by Flance Sinner's successful policy of starvation and no quarter, was planning to take Eoferwick. Which meant Halligwithacland, Guthred's delightfully named district of Cumbraland, which offered him fealty and was fixed around Caerligwylid. And afterwards, Osrith had laughed out loud as she rode east, following the Roman wall, at her own apprehension about Caerligwylid, at her steely refusal to let the place where she had been forced against her will affect her. And Domhnall had agreed to it. But it had been Constantine's plan, though he hadn't known Domhnall would go along with it. Constantine, then, had proposed an incentive to be offered to Guthred as a gesture of Domhnall's goodwill, and Domhnall had made the gesture Osrith, in marriage. Further, he had known she was Edra of Bibbenburg. At the very least, she might be generous to him and believe that Domhnall might have been trying to keep her safe. In all likelihood, he had disposed of her as a solved problem. Edra of Bibbenburg would no longer be a potential threat of war between him and Elfric, and he might still get some advantage out of her. And yet, despite all of that, Domhnall was her lord, still her king. The king of Alba, Osrith had drawn her mind back to the present, is Constantine. Alba had been Constantine's choice of name, meaning Britain, in Gaelish. Pitland was now Dulrieter, and the people were Scots. The abbot wishes to see you, Guthred had said, after reading the letter again. He is one of my closest advisers. True, thought Osrith, malevolently. God, she would kill him. But, when she entered the monastery, she looked not into the face of the bastard who had tried to rape her, but into features she knew well. Abbot Findle, Guthred had introduced, brightly. I am sure you will get on. And on they had. Once Abbot Findle had taken her a walk down by the river, once a ghetto for the Brittonic poor, now a place where the Caerligwylid guard trained. Finolai! She had exclaimed, seizing his neck and hugging her old friend. And Finolai told her that his name at birth was Findle, and only entering Domhnall's service he had been Finolai. Osrith told him of Domhnall's demise, 7 years before, and that Constantine was in the throne now. He knew, but received her news with the same enthusiasm as if he did not. And another surprise met Osrith's eyes. She had known all about women falling in love with women, in the same way men fell in love with men. She had only ever felt it once, AMD then for a short time. But to see the beautiful half again, now a beautiful woman of Osrith's age, had taken her breath away. Half was still working at Caerligwylid, still in the service of the monastery, for she was hanging heading out on libes of twine at the back of the kitchens, yet with the same beauty Osrith had remembered. Had the Briton married her Norseman? Did she have children now? If she did, she looked as if the years had not touched her. Yes, I will offer fealty to Constantine, Guthred had said, giving her a letter for the king of Alba. But he must support me when the Aryan Norse invade to take Eoferwick. I will put the terms to him, Osrith had promised, and I am sure he will be favourable. And, as she made to leave on her sturdy skewbald, he had taken her hand. Is there any chance, Osrith ... Edra? I have thought of you many times, of us. Osrith had smiled, and shaken her head. None, Guthred. You are a kind man, a strong king. You know your own mind. You care for your people and are a good ally to both Constantine and Dyfnwil, and you allowed your sister to marry the man you had enslaved." She had watched Guthred's eyes widen, then narrow, when he realized she knew about Uhtred. "You accepted all of that. You the King Cumbraland deserves." And it had been that night, taking up an offer by Finoli to reside at the monastery's scriptorium for the night before journeying back to Constantine, that she had heard a strange thing. So strange that it had resulted in her mission, southeast, to her former home. Lincolnshire was threatened and, as such, King Ethelred of Mercia, who claimed the region, was seeking the bones of Saint Oswald. She had listened carefully to this. While it may have been the result of a drunken mouth-off by a traveller, Arthurith realized she knew him. Offa, he called himself, and by passing silver to him, had obtained further news of Osrith's once former king. She knew and venerated that saint, her long-time ancestor. Osrith had known that, on taking her name, that Osrith had once been a princess of Bernicia who had married an Ethelred, son of Peder, son of Penda, the Mercian king who had martyred Oswald. She had told the current Ethelred, Ethelflaed's estranged husband, when she had fled and joined the Mercian army, some of the happiest days of her life. He had laughed, and had told her that, unlike the former Queen of Mercia, murdered for her divided loyalty, she was safe to fight for him, if that's what she wanted. And now Ethelflaed and Ethelred had removed him from Bardsey. The Danes would want revenge. But thus was not the only thing Arthurith learned. Further silver had her slipping into a conversation regarding Uhtred, her elder brother. He was heading north with a serious bid to overthrow Elfric. Osrith would have dismissed the claim. She had heard many rumors over the years of Uhtred reclaiming their ancestral family seat. But the man said more. Much more. There was one other person, who she had known to live and whose existence was a mystery. With this man, she shared a mother, her younger brother, also called Uhtred. But he hates his father, but all tense he is loyal. He is bringing a mercenary army to the fortress to kill him. I know, the spy offer revealed, because I sold him the ship that took him to the Mediterranean lands, and the shipmaster reports back to me. He leaned conspiratorially across to Osrith. When he does that, his cousin will never, ever, recover Bibbenberg. Though Osrith didn't know her younger brother, she felt an instant warming to him. He had not abused her as Uhtred of the Danes had. And Constantine would have her press her claim for him, or at least an alliance, for then, he would be able to claim Northumbria to the wall, his long-held dream. Osrith could choose to be ambassador to her younger brother and aid Constantine's path. Or, block it. "Edward thanked you for the book," Osrith said, as he reached round to kiss her on the lips, something Constantine rarely did unless he was pleased with himself. He was pleased with Osrith too. She had returned, it was spring, and news had reached the king that Uhtred the younger had reached Bibbenberg. He reached up to her shirt and was now pushing his hand between her flesh and her bindings. "You always were ready with a clever answer," he murmured, kissing her again. "Would I be here otherwise? You could be spying for your elder brother." "If I were," Osrith moaned, and sighed, loudly, as the nerve pulses from what he was doing to her teats took effect, "he'd be at our gates in a heartbeat. Constantine knew her body so well, and how to incapacitate her. He stopped, though, and allowed her to talk. "He is too consumed by Bibbenberg," Osrith explained. "All his life he has wanted it back. He doesn't look left or right unless he is made to." Constantine sat up, fingering her nipples as the tension feelings began, before drawing his hands away suddenly and swinging his leg over Osrith, kneeling either side of her. His hard-on was pressing insistently against her leg. "I think I may have to make him," she said as he kissed her neck. Constantine placed one hand on her hip while the other back under her bindings, shuffling the cloth away from her tits. Osrith arched her back as Constantine put his lips to her nipple, grinding his teeth lightly around it. A tight, tingly feeling began to grow around Osrith's hips as he reached for the other, twisting it, not in anger as before but for pleasure, pinching gently then rolling it firmly between his digits. Osrith moaned at the feelings his practiced fingers brought forth. She was dampening, her body getting ready for him a second time as she hadn't been earlier that evening when a priapic Constantine sought to use her cunt for his own relief. She moaned again when Constantine's hand found her upper thigh and began to massage it. He then lunged for her mouth with his own. "When will you be leaving?" He broke off his hungry kiss. Hunger for land, the greatest prize of all for the king of Alba. His hand ran up the inside her leg, her hair brushing his wrist. This was a happy Constantine, and she knew she would let him take her as often as he wished, until he was satisfied. Constantine happy was eminently better than Constantine vengeful. She had mentioned Edward and wanted to prove to Osric he was better than the King of Wessex. At everything. Yet, only Osric would know which king was the best, and even then, they were so different in achieving the same goal, it was impossible to say who was the best lover. Except, Osric did know, and it was neither of them. Osric's true love, if he lived, and Offa the spy's rumor was true, would be riding at Uthod's left hand, defending his bondsman's weaker side. Finan Moore, Finan, whom she loved above all other, who must hate her after everything she'd done. Tomorrow, Osric breathed, as the king found her clitoris, and she splayed out her limbs on his bed at the crescendonic pleasure he was inducing by coaxing the nub into life with his tongue. For Uthod would not wait to take his former home and title. And her other brother Uthod would fight as much to keep the fortress. For the first time, Osric had a choice to make, one which would decide the future of Bibbenburg.